We can all keep going and keep struggling, even when we don't know what that next step is. But we are people of faith, and we will trust God, and we will keep trying to do God's work on earth.
Tell us about the first time you met Dr. King.
Well, I met him when I was a senior at Spelman College, and he came to speak in chapel. And chapel was compulsory. And I was a rebel about that too, except that I remember more about chapel now than about all of my classes. And the first thing I did when I began to chair the Spelman board was reinstitute compulsory chapel. But we had all the great speakers of our time. And this was in my senior year of 1960. 1959-60, I'd been abroad for 15 months studying abroad. Spelman was really ahead of the term then. And he came to speak in chapel. And I remember it as if it was yesterday. And I quote him right now, and when I'm having a hard time, I think of what he says about never giving up. But he talked about nonviolence, and he talked about love. But more importantly, he talked about the importance of keep going forward and keep moving forward. And he said, if you can't fly, you drive. If you can't drive, you run. If you can't run, you walk. If you can't walk, you crawl. But keep moving forward. And it rings in my head when you are dealing with all these folk in Washington who keep wanting to move us backwards, but we're never going to go backwards, never. And we're going to build on the progress of the last almost 50 years, which has been progress. And ebbs and flows, go forward, go backwards, but we've gone forward a lot, and we're going to finish this job of ending poverty in America, but starting with our children.
Did you get that sense when you first saw him speak that he understood the burden of this movement, of what he was taking on, the changing the world, and the weight that might have been?
Oh yes, he was always accessible. And I think that most of the times I saw him, he was depressed and didn't know what in the world he was going to do next. But he was always accessible, and I think I went to meet him right after that, said I wanted to come see him. He said, come see me. And I loved him because he was one of those adults who didn't feel he had to have all the answers, who could listen, who didn't feel ashamed to say, I don't know what the next step's going to be. And I guess many of the conversations I had was when he was struggling like we were struggling for the next steps.
Can you talk about how your relationship with him changed, how it evolved? First time you met him at Spelman.
Well, when you're 19 and you don't know, you say, I want to come see you after that wonderful talk, okay? And he said, certainly. And again, the accessibility was always there. And I remember he had to bump me because President Callender was coming, but he kept his word. He was always there to kind of talk one-on-one. And during that year, which is when the sit-ins began to bubble up, and when Greensboro happened, and obviously all of us in Atlanta were absolutely determined to follow, and we set up our own committee for human rights and published an appeal for human rights, and were meeting with our college presidents and the chief of police in Atlanta, they were about more containment, but wanting to listen, and Dr. Mays was all of our North Star in many ways. But during that period, when again they were more concerned about keeping the lid on, but they were accessible. We were talking to our college presidents, and they asked that we do this campaign for human rights, write a statement. And I must say, I reread it. It stands up as well today as it stood up then. It was terrific. But when Greensboro came, that was clearly the signal to say we can do this too. And we met very, very quietly and planned it, and then met with our college presidents and laid out what we were about. And I think it was one of the best sit-ins because we picked all public places. I went to City Hall. I led a delegation to City Hall. But we took the public places, bus stations, the State House. But it was always the places where we knew we'd have the best legal chance. And that was the first sound, and then the question is what was next and who was there. Our 7 college presidents were there to welcome their students, but more importantly, Dr. King flew up from Montgomery to welcome us, knowing that we had sort of gone against the grain, and it was just a wonderful reaffirmation. Then we moved to when SNCC began to get formed, and Ella Baker and sitting with him for those days at Shaw. But again, that was really, again, another thing of affirming the power of young people and the voice of young people, and we've never forgotten it.
I'd like to talk to about the Poor People's Campaign, how that came about. You talked really eloquently about visiting RFK and then bringing this message to King.
Mississippi wanted black folk to leave. They didn't want them to be there to vote. They didn't want to feed them. They were trying to starve them out. They were trying to, the violence continued. The attacks on federal programs and moving to food stamps where people had no income, and it was inconceivable to many people back then that there was no income. And it was terrible in 65 and 66 and 67. And hunger was epidemic. If you went out, as I did, try to go out every day or every week in the communities, you just saw the suffering. And you had to do something. And the poverty program and CDGM brought a lot of hearings and harassment about why the federal government was giving this group of church folk and civil rights folk, and that we were misspending the money. I was its general counsel. But in the middle of it all, when I was talking about Head Start, and Dennis was there to testify, I said people were starving in the Delta and they should come see it. And to my absolute joy, they agreed to do it. And AMSI could tell you exactly where to go on one day's notice, a half day's notice. And so that was the thing that really sealed me with Robert Kennedy, because I'd had an image about Kennedys. So we went up in the Delta, and AMSI found these children with bloated bellies and with had no food and poor parents, and watching Robert Kennedy outside of the cameras was one of the most moving experiences. And there's a famous incident of going in the back door of a baby with a mother in a dark room. I don't think they even had a wooden floor, sitting there, and I watched him just poke to try to get any kind of reaction out of that child, and couldn't. And it changed my whole sense about who he was. And he came outside. He was somebody who touched a lot, which was surprising. I mean, when I would say hello, he would just kind of, do a little pat. And he touched a child. There were some older children standing outside with lots of reporters who hadn't gone inside to look at Annie's child. And he asked the little boy what he'd had for breakfast. He had it yet, nothing yet. And asked him what he had for lunch, and it was nothing yet. You could just see how any adult and parent would respond to that. And the second thing that happened on that trip with the committee traveling out to see hungry families was I think it was in Cleveland, Mississippi, but in one of the Delta counties, and a little white boy, this dog ran out in front of the processional. What do you say it when you've got all the cars out there screeching? I mean, what do you call the thing? But at any rate, our procession of cars, and the child's dog ran out and got killed. And Robert Kennedy was furious, and stopped it, got out to talk to the boy, and told them to cut off the sirens. And so I became a groupie then. I'd had a very different image about who he was. And he went back after this trip, and with Joe Clark, they went over to see Orville Freeman the next morning. So they got to get food down there, Orville, and they began to be pushes. And yet it was hard, even for Kennedy, and even with key people on committees and bipartisan people trying to do something. But at any rate, he stuck with it. And in August, I had gone by to see him at Hickory Hill just on my way back to Jackson. And he was around his pool, and I told him how bad things were, and nothing was moving, and they were still charging for food stamps. Change is hard, folks, and you have to stick with it. I told him I was going to stop through Atlanta and see Martin, and he said, well, tell him to bring the poor to Washington. By this time, he decided he was running for president. And I went down to Atlanta from there before I went back to Jackson and went to SCLC. And he was depressed. I mean, he was sitting in his office by himself. All of us were he was struggling to see what do you do next. You had the Vietnam War. The country's attention was moving away from civil rights and from the poor. And I walked in, and he was by himself in the back of it, and I loved it. He always lived very modestly, and this was a very modest office. And he was depressed. And I told him what Robert Kennedy said: he ought to bring the poor to Washington. And he lit up. He just lit up. And he went home, and you can see what Coretta said about it. And he immediately began to sort of get the staff, who was not happy, I will just tell you that, and engaged. And some people came over from Marks, Mississippi, just to talk to him. And he'd been in Marks for a funeral and had gone to a center and saw children who were, the teacher had one apple for lunch, and she'd carved up that apple for 4 kids. And that was the first time Ralph Abernathy said that he'd ever seen Martin cry in public, but he had to leave the school because he couldn't believe they were each getting a fourth of an apple, and the hunger in Marks was palpable. But at any rate, he responded immediately and called his staff together, who was not happy about this, and there was robust debate over the ensuing months about whether Vietnam should be the big issue or whether it should be economic opportunity and jobs. And obviously it was obvious by then that the next step to talking about changing laws was to get people jobs. They had to eat, they had to survive, they had to work, they had to have an income. And so that was a very interesting follow-on set of months, but he stuck with it and committed himself to doing a Poor People's Campaign.
Tell us a little bit about Airlie House.
Well, Airlie House was a gathering of a retreat where I don't remember how many of us there were. I mean, whether it was 40 with 50. Joan Baez was my roommate, but I never saw her. But Andy and all of his people, and with some outside folk. And it was about where do we go next. And I always loved it because he had very big tolerance for different views. And Bevel was not an easy man to not, yeah. And I loved Jose Williams. I mean, they all had very strong views. And Jesse preached. In fact, I remember Jesse really did preach. And Martin listened. But it was a very robust discussion about where one should go next, with a lot of resentment about this Poor People's Campaign, and that Vietnam was the issue, and that black boys were dying over there, and that was draining all the money. Well, on the other hand, you had all these hungry people right here in America with no jobs and no income. And I don't think he wavered, and he waited for Andy always to find the bridge, young, to find the bridge between all of these robust discussants who never were lacking for a word or a view. And again, the patience of Job, as far as I'm concerned. I'm having opposing views, but at some point, so here's where we're going. But he was amazing, but it was a very moving meeting, a good meeting of open debate. And Jesse, it's funny, I can't remember Jesse's sermon, but he sure did preach. We moved away from there knowing we were going to be doing a Poor People's Campaign, not with a plan, not with a whatever, but that this is where he thought he should be next. But he also spoke on both because they were so interrelated. Again, the bridge role and the listener role and the trying to find the way forward.
It brings us to the assassination and how terrible that was. Can you tell us about where you were, how you heard about it, and what that changed for you?
It was awful. And at some level, I think it was inevitable. I wasn't surprised, but it was shocking. It was awful. And riots broke out, as you know, everywhere. And my first thought, including in the district, and my first thought was to go out and tell children not to loot and not to riot and ruin their lives. I went out into the schools to try to tell kids, for goodness sakes, don't loot and don't ruin your future. And this little boy, about 12, looked me straight in the eye and said, "Lady, what future? I ain't got no future. I ain't got nothing to lose." And I've been trying to answer that boy for the last 45 years. And I think about him telling the essential truth in this incredibly rich, powerful nation that has not the decency to assure every child a future. But we were devastated. I mean, it was just absolutely devastating. Not surprising, but devastating. It was kind of inevitable. And he was very depressed back then. In many ways, but he would keep going. I mean, he would keep going, but I think that he saw, if you look at his last sermons, you could hear inevitability in of his death in his voice. But even so, when the inevitable happens, you're not prepared for it. And the funeral was the funeral, and the march was the march. And it was. But the first thought from me is, how do you get up tomorrow morning and keep it going, and that you honor him by what you do. Nobody had enough time to mourn. We were depressed, but you had to get up and sort of carry on that, and so that just refocused us on how you carry forward without your leader, and with a very cantankerous, depressed staff, but we did, and I'm glad we did, because I'm of the view that it has led to things that will continue to lead to things, and this country is going to end poverty, and we're going to end child poverty. He really was a prophet who spoke the truth about who we are, and I cite often his concern that we were going to integrate into a burning house, riddled by excessive militarism and materialism and greed, and that when somebody who heard him that night, because he was very depressed, he was at the end. I mean, because the country was going to hell. When they asked him, what should we be doing? And he said, we all had to kind of raise our voices and go to a different level of protest. But I think that, he laid a major foundation for all of us. His speeches are as prescient today as they were then. We just got to figure out how to listen to him and follow him rather than just applaud him.
Do you miss him as a man, as a person?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The only I never liked about him is he never did a good I'm a firm handshaker. he always, I would think, I'd never called him a coldfish handshaker, but again, he was just a good human being, okay? And he was always accessible. I don't think there was ever a time when I needed to see him that I couldn't see him. And he didn't feel he had all the answers, and so you could figure out it's okay for you to have to struggle and not to know everything, and to trust God, okay, that you're not alone. And you listen to that sermon in the middle of the night, the time when this paid in his home, when he was sitting there saying, but you could almost feel the presence of God saying, Martin, stand up. And so he's a man who lived his faith, sacrificed for his faith, had an uncommon eloquence, an uncommon patience, and I just hope I can be 1/10 as good and have the staying power that he had. But he was a true prophet in our time, and to be able to have been a part of that and to have learned from him, and to have the privilege of carrying on in some small way what he began.
What's the biggest misconception about the real Dr. King that you'd like to correct?
The real misconception, we know J. Edgar Hoover tried to destroy, his character, whatever. But he was a man of deep faith and deep courage, who loved his country so much he was willing to die for it. But to die for it non-violently and at the hands of violence. What he talked about in terms of gun violence and the violence of war, and Bobby Kennedy, after he was assassinated, gave a great speech about violence. And we need to hear him. We need to hear him, and not to deify him, not to make him into something he wasn't, but his message was the message. As Abraham Joshua Heschel said, he was a prophet for our time. And so we don't need to praise him and build statues to him, we need to follow him. Because he was not a perfect human being, didn't pretend to be a perfect human being, was always struggling, was scared like the rest of us, but he was a man of God who had a message. And if you listen to that speech in his home about midnight, and not knowing where to go, but that we can all keep going and keep struggling, even when we don't know what that next step is. But we are people of faith, And we will trust God, and we will keep trying to do God's work on earth. And we will let it go at our peril. And so the chore between us, particularly now in this time, is to move us back toward community and toward decency and toward service and toward equality of opportunity and to make sure that every child has a level playing field. And so the point of honoring him is to don't have a Martin Luther King Day. You go out and do the work, and you make sure that every child has a chance to be who they are and to get a decent education and to be fed, and you fight people who try to take away the basic safety net, and you get out here, black folk and brown folk and everybody else, and don't just have a holiday. You do the work of saving your children and saving the values of your nation. And so the only way you can honor him, as far as I'm concerned, is by carrying on what he started. And boy, are we faced with extraordinary stuff today. And so that the issue is, what kind of movement will we do to end child poverty first and to end poverty in America? And so he is as prescient today and as relevant today and is issuing as much of a call to us today as he was calling to us in 1968. And I hope we will honor that call and hear that call and finish the next phase of his movement.